Hello, and welcome to my presentation entitled Widows of the Civil War, A Glance into the Lives of African Americans Through Civil War Widows' Pension Files. My name is Michael Willis, and I'm a genealogist with nearly 25 years experience in genealogy, and for the past several years, I've been blessed to research military records on freedmen and freed women of the slavery era and get a glimpse into their lives after the end of the war. This class is targeted towards beginners in African American genealogy, especially if you are not familiar with Civil War widows' pensions. When I began tracing my family tree, I didn't even know that searching a military pension file was a viable option for finding family history on my ancestors. And for those who don't know, these record sets can be the most valuable and comprehensive that you will ever find. So during this presentation, I'm going to share a few case studies that will provide a glimpse into the types of incredible, personal, and intimate information on African Americans during this most critical turning point in our nation's history. So let's get started. Now, before we get into the meat and potatoes of Civil War pension files, it's incredibly helpful to first understand the laws that were enacted that created the pension system in the first place and how those laws had impacted African Americans. These laws concerning military veterans, their widows, and dependents were known as Acts of Congress, and these acts were published in what was known as statutes at large, a record of legislation passed by Congress on all matters concerning the United States. So the first pension legislation was passed on July 14, 1862, which involved disabled veterans as a result of their service and those veterans were deemed eligible for pensions. The amount awarded depended on their rank and their injury, and their dependents, meaning their widows and children, were eligible for benefits in cases where the soldiers had been killed in action. Now, these early pensions, they didn't pay a lot, but that makes sense because it was a civil war, a war that was fought on our soil and the deadliest in our nation's history, which was estimated to have killed nearly 650,000 Americans. So after the war, over 2 million veterans had claimed benefits. And within the next few decades, the pension benefits were 37% of our nation's budget. So to illustrate, a totally disabled private received about $8 a month, but amounts did increase over time. And that was due in part because one, Congress was under increased pressure to support veterans and their families. And two, when the war became unpopular, the pension increases were used as a recruiting technique. So then there was the next act, which was the Act of August 7, 1882, known as the Notorious Adulterous Cohabitation Act. Now, that was a law that was enacted as a moral clause against women to prevent them from receiving benefits if they were found to have received financial support from other men they were romantically involved with and or claiming benefits for children not fathered by the soldier. But the biggest turning point was in June 27, 1890, when they enacted what was known as the Pension Dependent Act. And that expanded eligibility to disabled veterans who were unable to perform manual labor that they had relied on to support their families. And what was significant was that the disability did not have to be a direct result of the war. Then there was the Act of March 3, 1901, that allowed widows to receive pensions if they were remarried or divorced at no fault of their own. And then lastly, there was the Act of September 8, 1916, where widows no longer needed to even prove their financial condition for eligibility. So they didn't have to report that they were destitute. So by this time, the government effectively removed all restrictions hindering any widow of an honorably discharged veteran from receiving aid. Until those restrictions were removed, the usual eligibility requirements were that the widow show proof of the soldier's military service in which he only needed to have served 90 days, proof that the marriage had occurred prior to June 27, 1890, proof of the soldier's death unless it resulted from his military service, in which they would have that on file in his service record anyway. And until 1916, the widow could not have any means of support other than her day labor. Now, these factors will come into play in the pensions that I have to show you because they were recorded during these periods in time. You will see how the laws applied to these widows, and how they filed their claims. Some of the qualifying documentation that was accepted by the Bureau of Pensions were the soldiers' discharge papers, marriage and death certificates, and even photographs identifying soldiers if those were available. But in the absence of the required documents, what would the Bureau of Pensions find acceptable to qualify women in those days? Well, first, the special examiners assigned to these cases would interview not only the claimant, but third parties in their communities that would sign sworn affidavits. And of course, in the cases where those people were illiterate, they would make their mark with an X. And or they would provide depositions where they would give detailed accounts of how they knew the soldier and his widow, and possibly provide any intimate details of their lives that they witnessed firsthand. Some of the events they may have witnessed were their marriages, the deaths of their husbands, and or the births of their children. And as a result, the pension file may include certified documents and sworn statements from doctors or ministers. The pension system was complex enough and cumbersome, but for Black women, the challenges were that much more severe in meeting some of these requirements and complying with the law. For instance, marriages of enslaved people weren't legalized during slavery, so the Bureau of Pensions initially refused to recognize them. Secondly, there was the literacy problem. Becky Little, who published an article on History.com entitled How Black Women Fought for Civil War Pensions and Benefits, wrote that in 1864, the government began retroactively recognizing these marriages, but there were still other factors that made it difficult to start the process. Some veterans and families didn't know they were eligible for pensions or benefits in the first place. Pensioners were required to provide multiple records, from military service documents to marriage certificates to medical exams. Access to attorneys who could help applicants navigate the complex system was a barrier for many formerly enslaved families, as was literacy, since antebellum laws had punished enslaved people for learning to read or write. Third, Black women fought perceptions that their families were illegitimate, which also resulted in the perception that they were claiming benefits for children not fathered by the soldiers in question. So now let's show some examples of what we're talking about. The first example is the widow's pension of my third great grandmother, Maria Penny, also known as Mariah Penny, the widow of Jackson Penny. Now, before we discuss Maria's pension file, let's first talk about how I even acquired it. When attempting to locate pension files, I highly recommend starting with this record collection on United States pension index cards, which can be found on FamilySearch.org. Claimants who filed these pensions have their information recorded in these cards, and they have practically everything that you need. In this example, you'll see the soldier's name, Jack Penny, and his widow, Maria, my third great grandparents. Then you'll also see the names of the two regiments he served in. The first was the Corps d'Afrique, which was Company G of the 8th Regiment, and that was a colored militia that was then later reorganized into the United States Colored Infantry, Company G 80th Regiment, and they were reorganized once Abraham Lincoln allowed Black people to join the Union Army. Then next we have the two pensions on file. The first one is an invalid pension, also known as a disability pension, that Jack filed himself on September 8th, 1890, and then underneath that you see Maria's widow pension, which was filed 12 years later after her husband died. And then we also see here the applicant's filing numbers and their certificate numbers. The certificate numbers are evidence that the applications were approved and benefits were awarded. Once you're able to pull that information from a pension card, the next step is to then order the pension file from the National Archives. And when you pull the file, one of the first things you'll see is documentation that the widow or the claimant is provided to the War Department. Here's an example of what Maria provided on behalf of her husband. It was his discharge papers, and it shows his name, Jack Penny, his rank as sergeant, when he mustered into the service, and the date he was discharged. One of the critical pieces of genealogical information that this had was where Jack was stated to have been born. He was born in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and he was approximately 24 years old. This document is the proof that Jack Penny was a sergeant in his regiment, because this document is his actual certificate of appointment to that rank in the United States Colored Infantry Regiment 80, Company G. As I stated earlier, one of the qualifying documents widows provided was proof of marriage to soldiers. Here, Maria provided her marriage license recorded by the officiating minister, and it gave specifics about the events, such as their names, Jack Penny and Maria Green, as well as that they were free people of color and that the event occurred on the night of February 28, 1867. So recognizing their marriage really wasn't an issue because it had occurred 2 years after slavery ended. Another qualifying document Maria provided for eligibility was this certificate as proof of Jack's death. It shows that his full name was Jackson Penny, that his date of death was March 24th, 1902, and that his place of birth was Missouri. But it also drops another bombshell that his mother's birthplace was Tennessee. This slide shows the back side of the certificate where Dr. Morgan certified the information was true and correct. This is why I say widows' pension files are a treasure trove of genealogical information. Originally, I couldn't find Jack's death certificate at the state archives where it should have been, so I'd assumed it was not recorded in the parish at the time the event occurred. Well, that's because it wasn't. If Maria had not filed for the pension, the special examiner from the War Department would not have reached out to the city's Board of Health and requested a certified sworn statement from the attending physician. Hence, Dr. Morgan would not have confirmed Jack's death. So without this pension file, I would have no death certificate. What's even more amazing than that are the depositions such as this one from Josephine Scott, a close associate of Maria Penny who could vouch for her and Jack, providing intimate details of their lives. And here's what Josephine had to say. I knew Maria Green, now known as Maria Penny, long before the war. I first met her in Macon County, Alabama, when on my way to Texas. Our masters were half brothers. My master was named James Shadley and lived in Georgia, and her master, Russ Bridges, resided in Macon County, Alabama, and we all went to Texas together and settled near Marshall, about 6 miles from Marshall, and lived there until after the war broke out. After the soldiers came there, she met Jack Penny, who was a sergeant in Company G. I don't recollect what regiment it was, and they became sweethearts. Jack finally rented a house for her in Marshall until the regiment left for New Orleans via Shreveport, and she and I both went along. Jack paid her way to New Orleans, and my fellow, Dennis Chance, now dead, paid my way. In fact, all of the girls who went along had their way paid by the fellows who had picked them out for wives. Jack had picked Maria out, and Dennis had picked me out for a wife. I never saw this claimant anymore after the war. So you can see here what black women had to endure during this time period after slavery. It seems so unconventional now, but you know, this was the life that they had to lead. And additionally, I had problems before I read this deposition. I had problems finding any information on Russ Bridges. I couldn't find hardly anything on him. But once she mentioned that he had a half brother named James Shadley, then I was able, through their census records, be able to connect the dots with the Bridges and figure out that they were half brothers on their mother's side. And now I have an opportunity to research the Shadley and Bridges family estates to see if I can find property records on my ancestors as slaves. So wish me luck. It gets even better when the file includes your ancestor telling their own story when they're interviewed by the special examiner, as you see here in the deposition of Maria Penny herself. Not only does she corroborate Josephine Scott's account of how her family went from Macon County, Georgia to Marshall, Texas, and her slave owner being Russ Bridges, She also talks about meeting Jack on the train and how he fell in love with me at once on the train, she said. She even said that she married him at his brother's house in New Orleans. And she also said Jack told her he was from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and belonged to a man with the last name Penny, who was a wheat farmer. When asked if a picture was ever taken of him during the war, she states the following: "No, sir. The soldier never had a picture taken in the Army. He had one taken soon after the war, but he gave that picture to his mother, Elise Penny, who has since died. But I think his brother, Arch Penny of Champaign, Illinois, must have that picture now. The only photograph I have of the soldier was taken 23 years ago, and that was taken while he was at church in a graft and nearly asleep, and that picture is badly faded. But still, anyone who knew the soldier can see a very striking resemblance between the picture and the soldier. He was sitting outside the Mount Zion church with his head down. I will loan you the picture." The pension file even had the envelope that the War Department addressed to Maria so that they could send it back to her. And at the top it says, "To be returned to claimant at 110 15th Street, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, according to promise." It even describes the contents: a picture graph in which the likeness of Jack Penny of Company G, 80th USCT, is shown near the little table in the lower row indicated by cross marks at head and feet. The scene presents Mount Zion Church colored and its congregation in front, taken 23 years ago in 1880. Well, the sad part about this story is that they broke their promise to return the picture to her. Now, how do I know that? Well, let me tell you a little story. When I originally ordered this file in 2016 and no picture was found, I'd assumed that they'd send it back to her without making a copy. But to be sure, I called the National Archives and asked, and they said, if it wasn't in the printed copies that we sent you, then it wasn't in the file. So over the years, I discovered other descendants of Jack and Maria, and no one was aware the picture even existed. This past November, my distant cousin, Christopher Smothers, who is also a professional genealogist, texted me to let me know that he was at the National Archives currently pulling pensions, and he wanted to know if there were any that I needed. Well, I had the ones that I wanted, but I asked him if he could double check this one, just to confirm that no photograph of Jack Penny was in the file. Within a half hour, he texted me this jaw-dropping photo. Let me tell you, I was working when this picture popped up on my phone and I broke down crying. I was such a mess. I went to my manager's office, who knows that I love genealogy, and I told him what happened, and he was nice enough to let me go home for the day because I couldn't even function. I mean, I thought this picture was lost forever. Now, I've left voicemails with the church historian at Mount Zion to let them know what I have, but she hasn't returned my phone calls. But I haven't given up. In this business, you never give up. And this right here is the receipts for why. The back of the photo says Exhibit B, Mount Zion Church and Congregation at Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 1880, property of Maria Penny, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So the awesome thing about this phenomenal find of my family history is this picture is 145 years old, and it's now the oldest surviving photograph in my family history. Now, the War Department said that Jack was identified in the picture by marking an X near his head and his feet. So that would imply that he's the man to the right. But remember how Maria described him. She said that the picture was taken while he was at church and nearly asleep, and that he was sitting outside of Mount Zion Church with his head down. There is only one man in this entire photograph with his head down, and that would be this man. Quite frankly, I'm almost certain it is him for a number of reasons, not only because of the description, but also because in her deposition, she talks about how he continued to write her after they met on the train. One of his fellow soldiers testified to his association with Jack and mentioned how their commanding officer taught some of the men to read and write. And additionally, I found the conveyance records that detail when the church formed its articles of incorporation under the leadership of Reverend Isaac Palmer, and that Jack and 5 other men were appointed to the board of directors. They all together purchased the land to build the church a year prior to this photo being taken, which is why I believe it was taken in the first place. The only men who were literate and could sign their names on that purchasing document were Reverend Isaac Palmer and my third great grandfather, Jack Penny. And what do you think Jack is doing in this picture? He's not asleep. He's sitting at a desk writing. Maria Penny's widow's pension file is an example of an approved claim. This next example is about rejected claims and how, as a genealogist, you can discover critical genealogical information because the pension was rejected. This is my 3 times great grandmother, Sarah James Washington, who was born in Louisiana as the daughter of Gilbert James and Emily Jones. She was the widow of my 3 times great grandfather, Monroe Washington, and the mother of my 2 times great grandmother, Virginia Washington Willis. It becomes apparent looking at the beginning of this pension file that Sarah's claim was rejected because, for one, it shows that her husband's service was alleged. Secondly, Monroe had no prior claim before his death, as it shows down here, as well as Sarah is listed as illiterate. It says she does not write. Lastly, it shows here that the claim is submitted for rejection on the ground that the soldier's name is not found on the rolls of any company of the 80th United States Colored Infantry as alleged. So the question is why, and then we'll get into a little bit of detail about that. In Sarah's declaration for her pension, everything started to look good. On this paperwork, you see her maiden name, Sarah James, which is how I found out what her maiden name was. We also show that she says that she was married to the soldier at, it says Mulberry Ground Plantation, but it was really Mulberry Grove. I'm very familiar with that presentation in East Baton Rouge Parish. And it says that they were married in 1867. And then she also states that her husband died on February 27, 1910. So this is pretty cool because I at least know that they got married on a plantation that I know a lot of my ancestors came from. Now, in Sarah's original declaration, she claimed that Monroe served in the 8th Regiment, but in these sworn statements here by these 2 men, Mr. Celestine Campbell and Mr. Philip Barrow, 2 witnesses that were brought forward by Sarah and her daughter Virginia, these men claimed that Monroe served with them in the 10th Regiment, but not in the same company. They said they weren't familiar with what company he served in. And this became a continual problem throughout this entire file, in which there were multiple regiments, multiple companies that were mentioned as places where Monroe served. And unfortunately, the War Department could not validate the information. They couldn't go back to the muster rolls and find his information anywhere. They even started to suspect maybe he went under another name, but Sarah could never furnish any other name. She claimed he never went by any other name. So this became a problem in approving her claim. Part of the reason for this confusion is because Sarah told the War Department that her husband's discharge papers were burned in a house fire years ago, which made it very difficult for them to find him, and the fact that she was an elderly woman who couldn't really recollect accurately what regiment he served in. Now, she filed that pension originally in 1916, and this letter is dated 1925, so we are 9 years in with her trying to get her claim approved. And I think at this point she becomes desperate because she reaches out to the Baton Rouge chapter of the American Red Cross for assistance, and they write this letter on her behalf because the War Department is now asking Sarah to furnish more information about her husband to help them identify him. Well, the Red Cross, the American Red Cross on her behalf says Monroe was born on Red River near Cheneyville, Louisiana, and was the property of Mr. Lynn Tanner. He entered service from Cheneyville and was mustered out in Baton Rouge. Well, that was a significant statement for me because, one, obviously it gives me a slave owner's name, but when I researched Mr. Lynn Tanner, I found out his full name was Robert Lynn Tanner. And the Tanner family owned a significant number of slaves in an area known as Bayou Boeuf in Rapides Parish near Cheneyville. Now, some of you may be familiar with that place because if you've read the book 12 Years a Slave, you might know that that was an area where Solomon Northrop was enslaved. That's because Solomon Northrop's, one of his slave owners, William Prince Ford, was the husband of Martha Providence Tanner, and Martha was Robert Lynn Tanner's sister. So my family was connected to the same my ancestors were connected to the same slave owners that owned Solomon Northrop. And this is all information that I would not have gotten had her pension not been rejected. The two examples that I've shown you so far include a clean claim that was approved and another claim that was rejected due to insufficient information. In this example, I will share the circumstances surrounding a widow's pensions application initially being approved and her name added to the pension rolls, but due to an investigation, her name was then subsequently dropped from the rolls and she was denied any future payments. This is the case of Artemise Benton, my 3 times great-grandmother, and the circumstances surrounding her life that produced a very sad result. Before we begin, let me give you some general details about what I know about Artemise that I learned at the age of 16 years old. First, she was born in Louisiana, allegedly the wife of Edward Benton Sr., and you'll see in a few minutes why I say alleged. And then lastly, she was the mother of 7 children, all born in this order. The first 4 were Edward, Thomas, Charles, and Nellie, and the last 3 were Ernest, Katie, and Maud. Now, how did I learn this information? Well, when I was 16 years old, I attended the first Benton family reunion on my paternal grandfather's side of the family in 1988 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This is a copy of the original reunion program, which I still have to this day. And as you can see here at the bottom, the oldest matriarch known at the time was Artemise Benton, the pensioner I just mentioned, and her husband, the patriarch, known as Ed. Well, in the branches of this tree, you see their children listed, the same ones I mentioned on the previous slide. But what's important to note here is the youngest, Maud, was the last living child of the couple who was between 92 and 94 years old at the time of the reunion. So the information that you see here was primarily based on oral history. Not only from Maud's recollections, but also my great-grandmother Artemise Willis Jackson, the eldest daughter of Edward Benton, who you see here on this branch of the tree. So after I became a genealogist and started researching this side of my family in 2009, one of the first pieces of evidence I discovered was this 1880 United States federal census record in Baton Rouge, Louisiana for a Tomise Benton, highlighted in yellow. Now there's no husband listed, but you see the same children, at least the first 5 who were born at that time: Edward, Charles, Thomas, Nellie, and lastly we have here Ernest, who was approximately 2 months old. Now this census was recorded on June 7, 1880, so that would place Ernest's birthday approximately around the beginning of April of the same year. The last thing that I want you to pay attention to is the couple living next door that's highlighted here in blue. They list a mulatto woman named Wartha Wiederstrand, age 36, and a white man named William G. Maddox, age 55. Now, according to my distant cousin James, who I actually met on Ancestry.com, he interviewed his grandmother in the 1990s, and she told him that Wartha's full name was Hiawatha Wiederstrand. She also stated that she was Artemise's sister and that William G. Maddox was her common law husband of over 40 years, since interracial marriages were illegal until 1967. Now, I'll explain in a minute why these details are important to this case. When I look at the census recorded 20 years later in 1900, again, I see Artemise with her children, including Kate and Maud, who are now born. The only problem with that is they're listed with the last name Jackson and not Benton. And you'll also notice that their father's birthplace is listed to be Louisiana, all the while their sibling's father is listed to be born in Missouri, which implies these 2 girls have a different father And of course, that's not what the reunion program indicates. So Baton Rouge, we have a problem. One other point I might add is that we now have corroborating evidence regarding the birth date of Ernest Benton. Here it is recorded that he was born in March around the same time he's recorded to be born in 1880 on the previous census I showed you. Now, because all of the confusion over paternity, I started tracking death certificates on these kids to identify who's listed as their fathers. On this death certificate of my great-great-grandfather, Edward Benton, you see here that his parents are recorded as Thomas Benton and Artemise Benton. Well, that clearly changed the game for me because until then, I could not find much information on a father named Edward Benton Sr., if you will. But when I searched for Thomas Benton, the world opened up to me. I mean, I hit a genealogical jackpot. First, I found this marriage certificate of a Thomas Benton marrying an Artemise Weatherstrand in East Baton Rouge Parish on April 21st, 1870. Now, the correct spelling of Artemis' maiden name is Wederstrandt. Some in the South say Wederstrand. I have since found that the correct pronunciation, which is more of a Swedish/German pronunciation, is Widerstrand. But you can imagine the number of variations I've seen. Many times I've seen that name spelled phonetically, and it's more closer to the latter of Weatherstrain. Sometimes it's S-T-R-A-I-N or S-T-R-A-N-E, but usually it's some kind of variation of Weatherstrain. Next, I found this pension card for Thomas and Artemise Benton in the indexes showing Thomas served in 2 regiments, the 67th and the 65th U.S. Colored Infantry. It also appears that only Artemise applied for a widow's pension on August 8, 1892, and it was approved. So with this information, I was able to order the file. Her file literally addressed all my unanswered questions. First, aside from her husband's real name, it addressed why he was not present on the census records. According to her affidavit, Artemise indicated that her husband died, but that the event occurred in the country where no record is kept, and because the attending physician, Dr. James S. Maples, who resided in Baton Rouge, he had died. But the next affidavit provided by her longtime neighbors, Ben Green and Amelia Clark, provided witness testimony to the death of Thomas Benton. And in there it states that they have known the claimant and soldier since 1875. They were then living on Mike Lane's place in 7th Ward, East Baton Rouge. Soldier died on Mike Lane's place December 23rd, 1877. We were present at his funeral and saw the soldier when dead. We lived on Mike Lane's place. When the soldier died, the soldier had been sick for some time before his death. We don't know of our own personal knowledge what disease the soldier died of, but we heard Dr. Maples, the attending physician, say it was consumption. Additionally, to confirm her financial condition, her brother-in-law, William Maddox, provided this affidavit stating that he was well acquainted with the widow and claimant in this case and lived nearby. Claimant has not remarried since the death of the soldier. There had never been any divorce between claimant and the soldier, and they lived together as man and wife to the day of the soldier's death. William goes on to say, I know the claimant does not possess any property and depends for a living on her own labor such as washing and ironing. The claimant has never been married before her marriage to the soldier. Now, Maddox further elaborated that because of his close personal ties to the couple, he had kept a record of the births of their children, which was incredibly helpful to Artemise because she claimed benefits for the youngest child, Nellie, who was born August 30th, 1877. That was just 4 months before her father's death. But wait a minute. Doesn't that mean Ernest is not a child of Thomas Benton like Kate and Maud? The census records pretty much corroborated that since they estimated his birth to be in March of 1880. To add to the narrative, another document providing corroborating evidence is Ernest's World War I registration card in which he stated his full name to be Ernest Gibbons Benton and his birthday to be March 29, 1880. So there it is. So according to this timeline, it doesn't seem like it's possible for him to be Thomas Benton's son. Additionally, he identified as white and moved to New York and became a Manhattan firefighter. Now that's pretty consistent with what I knew from oral history. According to this New York State marriage record to the right, he married a white woman named Anna Cholupa, who I've since researched and found out that she was of Austrian descent. But also to add to the confusion, although he claimed to be born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, he also claimed that Thomas Benton and Artemise King were his birth parents. So it doesn't make sense. And when you cross-reference that information with Artemis' pension declaration, William Maddox provided a sworn statement that these 4 children were born to the soldier, Thomas Benton and his wife Artemis. But notice the 2 signatures at the bottom, William G. Maddox and Ernest Gibbons. That appears to be her son. This is a hot mess, isn't it? So how do we clear all this up and get to the truth? Well, when I first started out discussing this case, I said that Artemis initially received benefits until an investigation ensued. This letter, which was sent to the Bureau of Pensions, laid the foundation of accusations against Artemis and was the catalyst for everything that happens next. Because these scanned images have grammatical errors and are hard to read, I'll just focus on a few excerpts. But what the writer does is they accuse Artemis of having lived with 3 different men since the death of Benton, and has 3 illegitimate children, 1 white one and 2 colored ones. They also say that she's built herself a fine house, now living in it with these children. This has been done with Uncle Sam's money. And they go on to close out this letter by saying that she has by no means lived a respectful widow since the death of Thomas Benton. Now it says, respectfully yours, JKSK, and I'll get to who I believe that is later. But for right now, just understand that this person accused her of violating one of those acts of Congress that I talked about from the beginning, the Notorious Adulterous Cohabitation Act. As a result of that letter, a special examiner was assigned to this case to investigate the allegations. The examiner interviewed Artemis, and this is what she said. She said, I've not remarried and I've not gone through a marriage ceremony with any man. I have not lived openly with any man. I have given birth to 3 children since Thomas Benton died. The first is Ernest Gibbons, which should be Gibbons, by a white man named Gibbons. He is in his 18th year. I have 2 children by Andrew Jackson, a colored man, and he had a wife with whom he was living when I gave birth to those children. The oldest of the 2 is Katie, who will be 8 years old in August next, and Maud, who will be 5 years of age in next February. The 3 children above named are the only ones I have given birth to since Thomas Benton died. I've never lost a child. Andrew Jackson did not live in the house with me. I just knocked along with him for 4 or 5 years, and the neighbors, some of them, they knew about it. His wife raised a question about it and came to me and asked me about it, and I just told her, and then I dropped it. Andrew Jackson did not support me, but he would give me money occasionally. He would come on Thursday nights and Sunday nights. He never did stay all night with me. I was cooking at the white man's house, and he, the white man, caught me there. In January of this year, Henry Banks rented a house with 7 rooms, and I rented 2 from him and lived there during January and part of February. We were going to be married provided I did not get my pension. I never once had anything to do with him. The church people began to get behind me, and I moved out. I did not care so much about the church law, but I was looking out for my pension, and I did not want them to get anything on me. Banks is not friendly with me now and does not come to my house. I am not sweethearting with anyone now. I am living honest. I have not had a regular sweetheart since Jackson, and I quit, but I have had a colored man named Smith once. Smith is dead. I have never been called by any name other than Benton since the death of my husband. I cooked and washed for Henry Banks, and he helped pay rent. We both bought grub and all ate at the same table. He slept in his bed in one room and I slept in mine in another room. My little children slept with me. Banks began to boss my children about and exercise supervision over them. He thought I was going to marry him. I had promised to marry him in the first fall month. My first pension came in February while I was living in the house with Banks. After my pension came, I told him I would not marry him. That's when he drew cold to me. I was told if I married again, I could not get my pension. I drew $24 in February and my prior money came before that time. I bought a lot of ground for $150 and built a house for about $300. I am now living in that house. I own no other property and have no income except from my own work. I have fully understood and comprehended your questions and my answers are correctly recorded. This deposition as the same has been read over and explained to me. Artemis Benton. Now, I just read a few excerpts from her detailed 5-page deposition that for the sake of time and the constraints of this presentation, I will not be able to unpack because there is a lot there. However, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that although she fully acknowledged and admitted to all the allegations, there is much context that is missing to this woman's life and circumstances, as was the case for most women living during these times. To add a few more facts for context, we're talking about a woman born into slavery, the daughter of her enslaver, therefore biracial, physically desired by both black and white men, illiterate, widowed with 4 young children by the age of 23, a single parent mother with 7 children by the age of 40, living in a time when women had no agency, no voting rights, minimal civil rights, and no economic empowerment, having to rely on men for financial and domestic stability. As I highlighted in the beginning of my presentation, black women in particular faced racial stigmas that made it difficult for them to get the benefit of the doubt and be comprehensively evaluated. Artemis was dealt a pretty bad hand in life and she tried her best to navigate the situation. And like anyone, she fought for survival to provide for her children. And when a glimmer of hope came for her to be financially independent and non-reliant on any man, the rug was pulled out from under her. And although she was found in violation of the notorious Adulterous Cohabitation Act of 1882, she thought the superseding acts of 1901 and 1916 would open up a pathway for her to be reinstated since they granted eligibility to remarried and divorced widows regardless of financial conditions. As a result, the file shows that she fought for reinstatement to the pension rolls for the next 30 years. Legal consultants wrote letters such as these on her behalf requesting reconsideration. Now, this letter was written 2 months after her benefit payments were halted. The notary public testifies that Artemis appeared before him and declared that she is the widow and claimant in this case, that for 8 years after the death of the soldier, she had no sexual relationship with any man, but struggled along in poverty by hard labor to maintain the 4 young children of the soldier left by him at his death, and that she has never lived under the same roof with any man as his wife or in notorious adulterous cohabitation since the death of the soldier, but she admits having intercourse with Andrew Jackson and having 2 children by him since the death of the soldier, that he aided her in maintaining the children of the soldier and raising them, which had been a hard struggle with her, for that more than 1 year before the allowance of her pension, she had ceased to have any sexual relationship with the said Jackson or any other man, and from then until the present time has lived perfectly virtuous, that she begs the Honorable Commissioner of Pensions not to drop her name from the pension roll, that she should be shown some mercy and consideration of the struggle in life to maintain herself and raise the soldier's children, and that she respect the case of the woman brought by the Jews before Jesus Christ for a similar offense and prays for a like judgment in this case. You know, that brings me back to my speculation on who blew the whistle on her. I used to believe it was Henry Banks, the man whose marriage proposal she rejected after she was awarded her pension. I thought maybe he was jealous of her and that his ego wouldn't allow him to take the L. But as I've analyzed this pension and I've studied it for over 10 years, I now believe it was Andrew's wife, Joanna Jackson, who wanted to not only retaliate against Artemis for her affair with Andrew and the financial support he gave her, but also because I think Joanna and everyone else in the community who witnessed Artemis purchase that home and provide for her illegitimate children judged her and saw her as unworthy. And here she is begging, literally pleading in the name of Jesus Christ for grace and consideration of a second chance because all she wanted was to ensure that her children were taken care of. Now, there's more to this story that occurs with the children who were impacted by this turn of events. They spent the rest of their lives seeking restitution for their mother. But that is a story for a different day, and unfortunately, we're out of time. Now, to recap the topics that I discussed and some of the resources that I mentioned, please keep in mind that a lot of that information will be in the curriculum that you receive, but you want to familiarize yourself with the statutes that I mentioned earlier and understand the eligibility requirements and acceptable documentation from widows that would have helped them be awarded benefits. Also, review the pension card index collections on Family Search. Those are an absolute gem. You also want to make sure you search for soldiers' names on the National Park Service website where you may find information that will lead you to pensions. And when you do get that information, you can go on the National Archives website to order the pensions. Most of the information that I shared with you came from ordering the entire files from that website. I would also highly recommend checking the International African American Museum website because they are starting to post pension files there. It's not a huge collection, but they're continuing to add them as we speak. Also, there's the Freedmen's Bureau record collection. In the Freedmen's Bureau records, you can also find some military information that may lead to pension files. This concludes my presentation. If you're interested in more of my genealogical content, including my recently published book, Finding Binky, which is the first of my book series entitled When Your Ancestors Choose You, please scan the QR code on the right side of the screen. Or you can just go to Amazon's webpage and type When Your Ancestors Choose You in the search field at the top of their screen. Also, please take note of my website address right here in the middle of the screen, michaelalwillis.com. It has been an absolute honor and pleasure to present this information to you today, and I hope you found value in it, and I hope that it guides you on the rest of your genealogical journey. So thank you for your time.